So good evening, everyone. Tonight we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Calum Neill, who will discuss his latest book, Jacques Lacan, The Basics, which I have here, and had a very good time reading past a week. Now, those of you who are joining us today for The Basics, I'll start with something quite basic. To speak a little bit about Jacques Lacan, who was a French psychoanalyst and a teacher who had a significant influence on psychoanalysis and also broader intellectual thought during the 20th century. And despite his relatively small body of written work, his ideas keep on challenging conventional understandings of identity, ethics, and social life up to this day, not to mention the psychoanalytic clinic. Now, Lacan's work is collected mainly in two volumes that are called Ecrits and Autres Ecrits, along with his transcribed seminars. And, well, they are usually presented as a formidable challenge to readers. His dense and often obscure style, well, we can say, sparked debate, with some arguing that Lacan's complexity was a deliberate effort to prevent misinterpretation of his provocative ideas. We'll get to that right now, Calum. Now, Calum's book aims to make Lacan's challenging concepts more accessible, but it clearly and directly also acknowledges the inherent difficulty and necessity for personal interpretation that I think Calum stresses quite well in the book, Lacan himself demands. So through this book, I think Calum invites readers to engage deeply with Lacan's teaching, and well, he encourages us to think for ourselves also about the implication of these ideas. So today, you'll join me and Calum as we explore this, the profound and intricate ideas of Lacan that are elaborated in the book. So we will engage with notions that Calum mentions in the book. Calum, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, Leon.
Of course, not for the first time, gladly. So let's
Berlin this time, sadly.
Next time, as we say. Let's begin then. So first of all, I wanted to speak about Lacan's style. You know, Lacan's style is often described as dense, impenetrable, and well, it has been a focal point for both his admirers as well as his detractors. And some argue, as I've previously mentioned, that this complexity stems from a certain pedagogical vision that he had, suggesting that the struggle to comprehend is a deliberate part of the learning process. And in this sense, it ensures readers to engage deeply and take responsibility for their interpretations. Others think it is pure charlatanism. So you engage with this topic in your book, and I wanted to begin by asking you, well, in your view, was Lacan's challenging style a deliberate educational strategy, or does it border on charlatanism? I mean, what is the purpose behind this elusive approach? And what do you think Lacan aimed to achieve by never getting straight to the point?
Yeah, no, it's a great place to start, Leon. The question is actually deceptively complex, I think, because in many ways the question itself goes to the root of the problem of reading Lacan and the problem that Lacan himself is trying to grapple with, which is intention. You know, what is Lacan trying to do? Well, how would we know what he's trying to do? All we have are the texts themselves. So already we're at the point of interpretation. How are we interpreting the fact that these texts are, I think it's undeniable, they're not straightforward. Yeah, these are not, you don't pick up the Ecrits and start reading and, think this is like reading an airport novel. It's, I'll be finished by the time I get to my destination. in many ways, I think with the Ecrits, there is no finishing because it's a labyrinthine text. It's a challenging text. It's never really linear, although, in one sense texts are always linear, but Lacan forces you to keep going backwards as you read, and reading over a sentence multiple times to tease out different strands of sense, of interpretation. So one point, I think it's undeniable these texts are challenging. Maybe there's someone out there for whom they're not challenging. I've not met that person yet. Why does Lacan write in this way? Well, point one, I'd say, is we don't know with any guarantee what Lacan's intention was. There have been people who've argued that Lacan simply wasn't very good at writing. So he writes in that way because it was the only way he could write, or he wrote in that way to mask the fact that he couldn't write in a more straightforward way. I don't think from reading the text that's the case, because particularly when you read the texts, so you mentioned the Ecrits and the Ultra Ecrits, but there's also the bigger body of Lacan's work, which we access through text, which is the seminars, which were delivered as oral texts and now exist in edited volumes. But particularly when you read the work which was intended for publication or more direct publication, the written work, the Ecrits, the way it's written is so dense, so intricately woven, that the ideas don't follow a straightforward exposition of an idea. So if you think of particularly British philosophers, people, I'm thinking people like David Hume, who writes in this incredibly logical way. You can follow his argument. It's not necessarily an easy argument, but he lays out his argument in quite conventional ways. You have a series of premises which lead to a conclusion, which then form the basis of the next premise, which then works on in this kind of unfolding sequence. Lacan is much more backwards, forwards, with multiple ideas, not necessarily sitting in a complementary fashion with each other, but condensed into one short paragraph or one sentence. So that suggests to me there is an intention here. We may not know exactly what Lacan's intention is, but by looking at the text itself, it's so intricate that I don't think it could be anything other than intentional. So I would dismiss the idea that he's a charlatan. I think in some ways there is a charlatanism to Lacan's performance, but I think fundamentally what he's trying to give through his teachings is something real. To put it, to use Lacan's own term, he's trying to do that both through the delivery of the message, but also through the medium through which that message is delivered. And I think that's what you get Lacan both in the style, or the style complementing the message or messages that are embedded in that style. And as you suggest yourself, it's part of that is about an ethics of reading or an ethics of interpretation. Lacan, as I think we have to always remind ourselves, was a psychoanalyst. He was concerned with the clinic. I don't think he was only concerned with the clinic, but he was always concerned with the clinic. And the clinic is about, amongst other things, it's always about interpretation. And I think Lacan carries that through into his teachings, whether that's the seminars or the Ecrits. He's trying to teach people about psychoanalysis, how to do psychoanalysis, how to think around psychoanalysis, and how to think through many of the constructs or the ideas that populate psychoanalysis. And to do that in a way which is true to his idea of psychoanalysis, he can't simply tell you the answer. That would be against his own teaching. So again, the style and the medium and the message are bound up together. It puts you as a reader into a position where the interpretation you come away with is your interpretation. It's not simply, there's no, I think, let me sort of rewind a little bit. I think when you read any book, you take the simplest children's story, and you read it, what you come away with is your interpretation of the story. But you have the the illusion that has just somehow fallen off the page and has been transmitted directly to you. So the simpler the text, the more easily we fall into that trap of thinking this was immediate, this communication. My interpretation is the author's meaning. We're somehow wedded. And I think what Lacan does through his style is breaks the possibility of that illusion of immediacy. Mm. You have no sense in reading Lacan that you have got directly to Lacan. You are always forced to say, this is my interpretation of Lacan. And that in itself is, going back to the book, that makes writing a book like this incredibly difficult, because you're immediately faced with an impossibility, because somehow to be true to Lacan would be to not write the book. And yet my job was to write the book. So I had to, one and the same time, present a reading of Lacan, or many readings of Lacan, different bits of Lacan, while at the same time trying to encourage the reader to almost dismiss me, take this and then, get rid of it, go and read Lacan for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Which I think there is no there is no higher cause maybe in teaching, in pedagogy, than getting the reader, the student, to go out there and do something with their own desire. And yes. I think that the book is not presented as a final word. It's presented as a first few words in a sentence that the reader will have to complete later.
That's the hope, at least, yes. And I hope it brings new people to Lacan. I hope it brings people who have previously either been intimidated by Lacan or dismissive of Lacan. And that, Lacan, that's just esoteric nonsense. And if I can open that door and invite a few more people to come into the world of Lacan, not necessarily to sit down and stay forever, but, come in, have a look around and, explore a little bit, and then maybe leave, but leave thinking slightly differently, then job done.
Mm-hmm. So let's then engage. Well, we engage with the style. Let's then engage with the original audience. Lacan was speaking, initially at least, to an audience of psychoanalysts. So his work aims at the work of psychoanalysts. And when we even go back to Freud, he placed a great importance on separating the training of psychoanalysts from the structures of universities and medical institutes. And Lacan deeply shared this sentiment. And this separation underscores a critical distinction, right? Psychoanalysis and, let's say, psychiatry, we can say psychology today, do not share the same object of study. And it is this object that defines a science. So I'd like you to maybe delve a little bit into Lacan's approach to psychoanalysis and why, at least how you present it in the book, it differs from the psychiatric one. What are, let's say, specific objects of study for each? And, how does particularly Lacan's focus on language reshape our understanding of mental health compared to the traditional psychiatric models?
Yeah, so, the simple way I look at that, and this is possibly slightly reductive, certainly talking to some psychiatrists after publishing the book, I think they felt that I was particularly discussed this with a psychiatrist friend of mine who read the book, and he said, argued I was a bit unfair on psychiatrists, that it was slightly oversimplistic. Now, so that's maybe an open question, but to me, it seems psychiatry, insofar as we understand psychiatry as a medical profession, a medical discourse. It's certainly in the UK, it's still very much an extension of medicine. In order to be a psychiatrist, you have to be a doctor first, and this is the case for Freud. This is the case for Lacan. and it's still the case for psychiatrists today. But what that does is it positions psychiatry within an overarching medical discourse. So medical discourse aims at cure. That's what medicine does. It tries to find out what the ailment is, and it tries to provide a cure or a way to live with a more comfortable way to live with the problem. Mm-hmm. That's not what the aim of psychoanalysis is. Psychoanalysis, in my understanding at least, is not about a cure. It's much more about an exploration. And it's not simply we have two very similar discourses aiming at slightly different outcomes. It's the conception that sits behind that. So in terms of, I say, what it aims at, the aim is not simply to describe the end point, but to describe the trajectory towards that end point. Mm-hmm. And for psychiatry and psychoanalysis, to compare just the two, they have those trajectories are very, very different, because the entire landscape, the direction, the object, the content is entirely different. Mm-hmm. So there is a different conception of subjectivity or personhood, what it means to be a person. And that necessarily then folds into a different conception of what we might call mental well-being, mental illness. These are terms we tend to use now. They weren't terms that were so much in frequency when Lacan or Freud were writing. But the terminology that arises through the various discourses are very different. The idea of mental well-being, for example, means very little in a psychoanalytic world, because what would it mean to be? Well, you think mental health? Mental health is quite a good case, because the word health comes originally comes from the Germanic, meaning wholeness or whole, and that idea that there is somehow a wholeness, and mental ill health would be when that wholeness is missing, where there's a gap. For Lacan, there's always a gap. That's a starting point. That's a given. There never is going to be a wholeness. So the idea of being in mental health is an impossibility. So if we start treatment from the perspective that we will never achieve wholeness, then that's a very different experience from starting treatment from the idea that wholeness is a possibility. It may not be a possibility for this particular patient because they're broken in some way, but it is a possibility in the world that we can compare that patient to. None of that holds in psychoanalysis, where there's no comparisons, because you treat the individual that's with you rather than the individual as one example of a bigger sample of a population. And you treat them in their own terms, and you work with them towards where they want to go. They leave the clinic at the point they feel comfortable leaving the clinic. They leave having achieved something, or having put in place some kind of change, but that's never predictable in advance. Whereas in a psychiatric model, the desired cure is always predictable in advance, because it's the starting point. Mm-hmm. So for me, they're really radically different perspectives, where, if we step outside of all that and say, okay, we look at the psy professions, at least therapeutically rather than academically, they all aim at the same thing. They all aim at taking people who are unwell or unhappy and working with them to a point of greater wellness or greater happiness. And possibly those two things are the same, possibly not. So very broadly, we could say there is some kind of family resemblance there. But I think as soon as you get into the details, the direction of the treatment is radically different.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a certain, let's say, mismatch between one's sense of self and one's oneself. This mismatch is often seen as a sign of disorder, right? In these type of discourses, and then therapy aims to achieve authenticity, right, through self-understanding. And many people come to the psychoanalytic clinic saying, I'm here to understand myself. But we already see this in Lacan's concept of the mirror stage, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, where he presents this mismatch as the very genesis of the self. Right? Lacan has this notion of méconnaissance, in English maybe misrecognition. And this suggests that our knowledge of ourselves is fundamentally formed on a mistaken basis, right? Which paradoxically only also marks the nascence, right? The birth of the self. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on this Lacanian perspective in terms of the contemporary desire for authenticity, remarking on how this understanding of the self born from misrecognition influences our quest for genuine and authentic identity. You spoke about wholeness here. And I mean, what are the implications here that we must take in our conception of the work of analysis?
Yeah, so I mean, I gave over quite a lot of space in the book to the mirror stage, and really I take it as something of a starting point for my discussion of Lacan, because it seems to me so fundamental this concept of the mirror stage. We're talking about the basics of Lacan in some ways, and that is the basic of his theory. Core to any practice of psychoanalysis, and I think really even this extends to the other side disciplines, whether they like it or not. Core to their practice is some kind of conception of what it means to be a person. Because if you're going to treat people, then you need to have an idea of what it is you're treating. And this is where Lacan immediately departs from most other disciplines, and even to some extent from other psychoanalysis, other branches of psychoanalysis, that he starts on this fundamental point that the subject is split, and the idea that you have of yourself is merely that. It's an idea. It's a mistake, both in the sense that it's an error, but also it has been taken from somewhere else. So the idea of the mirror stage, this idea that you somehow internalize an idea from outside and then start to confuse that internalized idea with your own self. That, to me, that's fundamental to what Lacan's trying to do. Fundamental in the sense that it's the basis. Everything else, in some way, is built on that idea. We can't remove that idea and still have Lacan. So yeah, I'm not sure what the rest of your question was. Sorry.
Maybe we can just talk about the mirror stage a little bit. Everybody reads about the mirror stage in undergrad courses on Lacan. Do you think it's important? What do you find interesting in this model that is sort of maybe the most famous one in the English-speaking world?
I mean, I'm not sure precisely why the mirror stage is the of the Ecrits. I think it is the most read of the Ecrits, the most famous of the Ecrits. I think partly it's because it's so short. It's 7 pages long, just over 7 pages long, I think, in English. So it's accessible. It appears in lots of anthologies. Certainly myself as a student, that was my first experience of Lacan, reading the mirror stage, and I carried that on in my own teaching. My students, I give them the mirror stage to read. It's not. I mean, I think going back to our earlier bit of our conversation, to use the word accessible in relation to Lacan seems a slightly perverse language, but of Lacan's work, in some ways, the mirror stage is, amongst the more accessible of his writings. But I think more than anything else, it contains so much of what comes later in Lacan, for echoes, later theory. So Lacan certainly wasn't a thinker who had already worked out all his ideas in advance. it's not the case that Lacan in the 1930s and 1940s had kind of worked out this grand scheme and spent the rest of his life just kind of unraveling this idea. He's constantly developing his ideas, questioning his ideas, but there is still something foundational in the mirror stage that we can see these different streams of thought coming out of the mirror stage, and we can go to very late Lacan and read back echoes of that, or pre-echoes of that in the mirror stage. So it works really well from I'm a teacher, I'm not an analyst. From a teacher's perspective, it's a fantastic text because it gives you so many different starting points to begin to understand later bits of Lacan. You can bounce off the mirror stage into different bits of Lacan. It also ties Lacan to a lot of his own foundations in a really useful way. So you see in the mirror stage, Lacan's relationship with Descartes, his relationship with Sartre, his relationship with Hegel. So you have that kind of philosophical positioning happening in the mirror stage. But you also have him engaging with Gestalt theory and elements of psychology. So you have that relationship with the side disciplines, you have the relationship with anthropology, with biology, and these, in such a short text, he's covered all these points of inspiration, zoology, and then towards the end of the mirror stage, he's engaging in with a series of literary texts as well. So it's an incredibly condensed, almost holographic piece of writing that contains so many different strands of his thinking, and yet, woven together in this very dense but actually rather coherent text. Is coherent the right word? I'm not sure. I've read the mirror stage, I think, more than any other text, other than Goodnight Moon, which is an old, I think 1950s, 1960s children's book. I think that and the mirror stage are the two texts I've read most in my life.
Mm-hmm. I hope to yourself and not to children. This might be quite dramatic.
Goodnight Moon I read to my son.
Okay, here we go.
Mirror stage. Actually, the mirror stage I read to my students. I used to read the text to my students.
So I definitely agree with what you're saying here, Calum, and we can really emphasize how it returns. The mirror returns again and again in the seminars, in different schemas and different perspectives. It is sort of an eternal tool that Lacan uses in order to develop his theory. And later on, it's even implemented to speak about things that maybe are only foreshadowed a teeny bit in the paper.
Yeah.
So let's move to another aspect that is central in Lacan's work.
So I didn't really answer your question about authenticity. I think that's a really important point. That
we can go back.
What Lacan's doing through the mirror stage is, although this is a text that was developed from late 1930s to late 1940s, so, almost a century ago, it's still hugely relevant to, I think in some ways arguably even more relevant to the world we're living in now, because he is very much grappling with this. Maybe grappling is the wrong word there. He's almost immediately dismissing this idea of authenticity. So it's almost his opening gambit, and the mirror stage is not his first, the first text he wrote, but it's very much seen when we look back at Lacan as kind of this foundational early text. And the opening of that really is to completely dismiss this idea of authenticity as something we would even entertain. You cannot have authentic. You can't be authentic because there's nothing to be authentic with. There's nothing to be authentic about. The self that we strive after is a mistake. So, and behind that mistake, it's not that there is an authentic other self. Behind that mistake is nothing. So what we have is the mistake. So the pursuit of authenticity is already a disastrous pursuit. And I think that's, that's not Lacan's conclusion. That's his starting point. He says, because we can't have authenticity. Okay, now let's begin.
Yes, and this also means a lot for the clinic, in terms of self-knowledge, understanding of the self, as though that is some type of goal, where in Lacanian analysis, the process would many times be completely opposite. Reaching to this initial point, as you were saying, the point where
I imagine that makes Lacanian analysis unattractive to many people, because that's precisely what they don't want. They want, they want an analyst who will tell them, okay, let's strip away the illusions and find the real you, or go to some commune in Northern California, and you'll find your authentic self. And that's what people want. And if they want that, great, go for that. But probably best not to go to Lacan if that's what you want.
Yes, one of the reasons. Let's take a step forward, Calum. So we'll get to some more subjects that you mentioned in the book. It's important to speak about language and its centrality. Lacan makes a certain wager on this centrality of language. And he posits that our relationship with language is fundamental to our experience of the world. And in this sense, there is no experience for Lacan that precedes language. And as you discuss in your book, this assumption is contentious. Right? Many critics argue that there must be some form of experience prior to language, and that psychotherapy can not only encompass language, but also has to engage with, let's say, emotional experiences that are pre-verbal or have nothing to do with language. So I wanted to ask if you could explain Lacan's rationale for placing language at the center of his psychoanalytic network, and maybe say a little bit about his justification of the claim, and I take this from the book, that even the night and the day are inseparable from language. Is this some type of linguistic idealism? It's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. There's this, in many ways, gets to the core of Lacan's thinking, and I think what's in play here really is a logical problem. We sit back and we can think in the abstract and think, well, okay, so language. What does language do? Language is a way of taking ideas and being the vehicle, the carrier of ideas from one person to another person. It's a way of recording information. So it's a tool. That's what language is. And I think a lot of people in the philosophy of language or psychology of language view language in that way. Language is a tool. We compare ourselves to other higher primates. They don't have language. We have language. And it's part of that tool development. It's kind of the ultimate tool. We have language. We can convey ideas. But Lacan's perspective on that would be that, well, that's an artificial standing outside of experience, purporting to look in and purporting to be able to see and understand an operation, and isolating language to or as one part of that operation, when in fact, if we think about it logically, that whole experience is wrapped in language. So the observation, the argument of what language is already something we conceive in language. So it's like trying to paint yourself out of a corner. You can't. You paint yourself back into the very corner that you're trying to paint yourself out of. And I think this is the really simple point that Lacan is making, that we can't think about anything without doing so in language. Language is how we shape thoughts. Now, we may experience things without language, or if you take the example of the baby, which is the one I think most commonly used. The babies, before they learn to speak, they don't have language. So there is a point where you have, at least on a physiological level, but also we assume that children have some kind of, babies have some kind of consciousness as well. They are sentient in some way, and animals too. And so that there is life without language. But the point for Lacan would be, but not for us. So the baby is not the one who's, sitting there in its crib contemplating the positionality of language in relation to its experience. It's only those of us who have language who are doing that, even if we're thinking of ourselves. So if we think of ourselves, you're thinking back to our own childhood, or our pre-linguistic childhood, or thinking about our own experiences, which we assume to be non-linguistic experiences, so immediate, I talk about this in the book, immediate experiences of nature, immediate experiences of other people in terms of amorous relationships and sex. And we often think of these things as being outside of language, but insofar as we think about them, they're inside language. So it's always a projection to the outside of language. So in that sense, so I think Lacan is making, in some ways, a very simple point, that we're trapped in language. There is no outside, there's no experience outside the language, which is not quite the same thing as saying there's nothing outside language, because I think Lacan's very clear there is something outside language, but we can't experience the something outside the language without bringing it into language. Mm-hmm. So whenever we experience something that's beyond language, our first move is to somehow wrap it in language and conceptualize it and narrate it and convey it, whether that's conveying to someone else or to ourselves. So we are trapped in language, but it's not that language is everything. And I think that's really fundamental to Lacan's ideas, because if language was everything, then there'd be no need for psychoanalysis.
Right.
It would all be okay.
Mm-hmm. And this brings Lacan to assert, something that is purely psychoanalytic, as you say, because up to now, we might be speaking about a certain philosophy of language. But for Lacan, there's the assertion that the unconscious is an effect of language. Or he states famously, this is a quote, that the unconscious is structured like a language. And here he makes a departure from the linguists and also from philosophers that spoke about the unconscious, like Schiele and Nietzsche, and also even from Freud in a way. So how does this perspective of the unconscious differ, you think, the most from these views? And in this sense, how does positioning the unconscious within this broader linguistic framework help us understand something about psychoanalysis, or about what is essentially psychoanalytic?
So I think this idea that the unconscious is, this quotation, this idea that the unconscious is structured like a language. My own personal perspective on this is the most essentially Lacanian part of Lacan's teaching. So Lacan, as we've already kind of mentioned, draws on various other interlocutors and inspirations, most obviously Freud. Mm-hmm. He draws on philosophers, doesn't he? Yeah. Descartes, Hegel, and these are all big influences shaping his thinking. But the idea that the unconscious is structured like a language, or his particular conception of the unconscious as articulated to and through language, is, for me, what is purely Lacan in Lacan. It's the bit of Lacan that is radical. And in a way, I think it's the bit in Lacan that pushes Lacan beyond psychoanalysis. If we understand psychoanalysis as having been invented by Freud and based in Freud's work, and then from Freud, we have this branching off of various different, let's say, competing fields of psychoanalysis, of which conventionally we'd see Lacan as one. But I think what all the other fields of psychoanalysis share is more or less Freud's understanding of the unconscious. And I think Lacan's understanding of the conscious is radically different, which makes him stand outside of the rest of psychoanalysis, to the point where, I think we could question whether Lacan is actually a psychoanalyst at all. It's so different from the other branches of psychoanalysis on this particular, but absolutely fundamental central point on the conception of the unconscious. And I think it's the bit of Lacan that is most difficult to grasp as well, because received knowledge tells us that when Freud first came out with the idea of psychoanalysis, it was controversial, and people found it outrageous and unacceptable. But I think now, 125 or so years later, we're nearly 125 years since the interpretation of dreams was published. I think people have very much come to accept Freud. Whether they come to accept Freud completely or not, I think is an open question. But Freudian language, Freudian ways of seeing things have spilled over into popular culture. It's part of our every day, and we accept the idea that dreams have significance. We accept the idea that we're not entirely in control of ourselves. We have forces within us that we can't understand, that we can't control. We even kind of accept some of the kind of more outlandish ideas from Freud. Accept maybe is slightly too strong a word, but ideas like Oedipus is, I think it's still quite a outrageous idea. But it's an outrageous idea that's almost we can talk about now. People get it. They might not personally identify with it, but they maybe identify other people as having experiencing that problem or that issue, that complex. And the unconscious, I think people accept the unconscious. I think that's, we maybe going to water it down a little bit and call it the subconscious, but, we more or less accept that Freudian idea. Lacan pushes away from the idea of the individual in a way that I think Freud had already started. This, Freud's idea, Freud decenters the individual in the sense that he takes away the notion that there is a self at the center of the activities. Mm-hmm. Lacan takes that much, much further and says the individual is not even the thing, but the thing is language. And language is almost coursing through the individual rather than being within the individual. So the unconscious for Lacan is not an individual unconscious. The unconscious is an effect of language. And I think that's a incredibly profound and incredibly difficult idea. Not difficult necessarily conceptually, although I think it is quite a difficult idea conceptually. I think to really get at what Lacan's trying to say there in his own work is hard. But I think also part of that difficulty is we're not really ready for that idea yet. It's too challenging, and it almost goes to the core of what Lacan's trying to do in his whole theory of psychoanalysis. That idea of pushing the individual away and saying, all these ideas you have of yourself, and this kind of brings us right back to the mirror state. It's kind of this idea you've taken of yourself. That's not it. That's not you, because there is no you behind that. And I think if we keep going with that, we come to this idea of the unconscious, which, okay, I can accept my ego is an idea. It's something I've taken in, but I've still got the unconscious, which, okay, I don't control the unconscious, but it must still be me. And this is, we can see this in Freud. And they can't say, no, not even that. Even that is not you. It's language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. Language is everywhere. The unconscious is an effect of language, but you've sort of hinted on that, and I'll continue this thread that, well, while Lacan says that there is no experience of the world without language, he also says that language is inherently insufficient to explain everything about the world. And this might appear contradictory at first, but it is central to his understanding of the psyche. And you give an interesting example. You parallel Heisenberg's ideas in physics in the book, which I love his ideas, and I also love this allusion to Heisenberg as ideas which disrupt the conventional ways of speaking about scientific phenomena. And in this sense, they illustrate something of the limit of language in capturing the full essence of reality. Now, in Lacan's framework, this unknown or elusive aspect of language is referred to as the real. Many students who study with me come with this question, but what is the real? And in the book, you speak about the imaginary, the symbolic, and you also say something about the real. So I wanted you to maybe tell us a little bit about this idea of the insufficiency of language and how Lacan's concept of the real challenges or complements traditional views on reality and knowledge.
So I guess, I mean, the real, like so much of Lacan, I think is one of these concepts that's you can approach in a reasonably simplistic way, but then there's always so much more to discover. And one of the things I do in the book is at the end of the book there's a reading list, and this is very much the idea in the book that here's a start, but if you want to find out more, these are some fantastic people to go to find more. And on the real, I would strongly recommend Tom Eyer's book on the real, which is a fantastic read if anyone's interested or your students are interested, particularly in the idea of the real. But I'll stick to the basics and go to the simple stuff. So there is a kind of, I think, a fairly straightforward, and in some ways, I think, quite commonsensical and kind of acceptable idea in what Lacan's saying with the real, which is there are things we don't know yet. So there are things, if you equate language and knowledge. And I think this is very much, in keeping with the way Lacan would think about it. Knowledge is constructed in language. So if we know things, we've found a way of putting them into language. And that's a constant process. We always kind of like to think the point we're at in history is, is it, we've discovered everything, but actually we know. And, even the most hardline natural scientist would accept this. Even, dentists accept this, that, there's stuff we know and there's stuff we don't yet know. So that's one example of the real. There's the stuff we already know, it's within the circle of our knowledge, and then there's stuff that's outside that, and we're constantly moving. So the circle is, we might say, if we're being kind of progressive about it, the circle is constantly expanding. So what was unknown becomes known. So we kind of venture into the real, but as we venture into the real, it stops being real because it's brought into language. Mm-hmm. And part of what's going on there, and I think in this, Lacan is being perfectly Kantian, really, in the way he's formulating this, that by bringing things into knowledge, we transform them, and we transform them in a way which there's an epistemological dimension to this, that we can't know the unknown, because if we knew the unknown, it would no longer be unknown. So there's kind of an aporia, an impossibility there. What we can do is we can translate the unknown into language, but there's always something lost in that process, or we always would have to assume there's something lost in that process, because language and not language simply can't be the same thing. But there's also, for Lacan, I think in many ways this is the more important point and slightly less obvious point, is it's not simply that the unknown is what lies beyond the circle of knowledge. The unknown is also all the millions, billions, trillions of gaps between all the bits that we know or we think we know. So the unknown isn't out there. It's in here. It's with us all the time. It's in every experience we have. Everything we try to capture in language always fails in some way. You can never, Lacan says it, you can never say it all. Mm-hmm. And I think the most obvious example of this is, you're working on this yourself in your book at the moment, the idea of love. Mm-hmm. In most people's experience, I think that's the perfect thing. You can't express love. Now, of course, you can express love. You can express affection, but you could never express love as love, because it's inexpressible. So love is real in that sense. Mm-hmm. Or when love is real, because it can't be put into words. The more you try to put into words, the more you fail to put into words. So there always ends up being more that can be said, more that needs to be said. But that's it's infinite. You never get there. If you were able to express love completely, it would die. It wouldn't be love. And I think that experience, we can kind of understand that in terms of the attempts to express emotions, particularly love, amorous feelings, relationships, and that connection between people. But really, that experience isn't everything. Everything you try to put into language is always in some way a failure. Possibly with the exception of kind of the very blunt tool use of language as an index, to point at things and name objects. Insofar as it works. And is there a real there? Well, of course there is a real there, but it's so banal. It's probably not worth discussing. But when we're trying to express complex ideas, important ideas, there's always necessary failure entailed in that, and that failure is the real, or that failure is indicative of the real.
So, if love is real, what is the real of sex? Huh? Let's get to that. Lacan works on this concept called sexuation that you engage with in the book. I think it's not for nothing. Freud explored the libido in his work, and well, he had this concept of a libido, and he associated it with men. But he was grappling with the question at the end of his career of what a woman wants. And in this sense, it resulted in views of femininity as oppositional to masculinity, where woman is a complement to man. But then later in his work, Lacan tries to move beyond this anatomical deadlock through his concept of sexuation, which you say also in the book is distinct from sexuality, gender, and object choice. In this theory, Lacan describes two independent subjective attitudes that he calls the masculine and the feminine. We talked about this a little bit last time we met. But I think that this approach, and let's try and speak about it and also criticize it, maybe, we must admit that it does revolutionize psychoanalytic discussions on femininity by providing a framework that highlights singular aspects of femininity that are independent of the masculine. So I'd like you to take some time to hook on to anything you want, but I mean, let's speak a little bit about Lacan's project on sexuation and why it became so central in his teaching. And maybe if you can say a little bit about the way it influences contemporary thinking about gender and gender identity.
Yeah, so I mean, as you say, Lacan, following Freud and I think following the academic and psychoanalytic discourse of his own time, employs these terms, masculinity and femininity. So he employs a binary. Mm-hmm. So in this sense, he's being perfectly traditional. There is a conception of humanity. We can take this right back to Plato. This conception of humanity that is constructed of this binary. But what Lacan does with that is really interesting, because he, rather than take a straightforward binary of saying, okay, got masculine, feminine, and either the two are complementary forces, or one is in some way the deficit of the other, that one is this one sex is secondary to the other. Lacan creates a very different binary, where he says one is within what he calls the symbolic. So this, go back to the idea of the real and the circle of knowledge. He says there is a concept of humanity which identifies within that, or can be identified, can be described within that. And then there is another experience of humanity which isn't entirely outside that, but isn't within that. Mm-hmm. Which is a very different binary. It's the idea that it's two positions in relation to a third, which is neither of the two. It's not two positions which are fundamentally predicated on a biological given, and it's not two positions which somehow define each other in a way. There's a yin and yang; they complement each other. They're both defined in relation to an experience of a third in a way which makes them not just a binary, but incompatible with each other. Mm-hmm. They don't fit together. And that's to me, that seems a fascinating way of reconceptualizing human experience. It is still a binary, but it's a very different kind of binary. Or put another way, it's a binary that opens up, at least on one side, multiple positions. So it's a binary between what's graspable and all the other possibilities which are ungraspable. I think where Lacan's thinking on this is a little bit stuck, is that he still uses the terminology of masculine and feminine, mm-hmm. which cannot but keep him located in that rather conventional, traditional, earlier 19th century, 20th century discourse. I wonder if Lacan was still teaching now, still alive and teaching now, if he would use different ways of talking about it. I can understand, I have my ideas of why he might have done that. I don't know why he did it, but I have an explanation for myself of why he continued to use the terms masculine and feminine, why he continues to refer to the phallus, and so still using that language that kind of roots us in a very particular way of thinking, while at the same time pushing us towards a radically different and much more open way of thinking. But there is a contradiction there at the same time. But I think the contradiction, certainly in the 1970s, when Lacan was working through these ideas, I think the contradiction was probably necessary because our way of thinking through these ideas the discourse hadn't developed enough to fully move beyond these ideas. And Lacan does start to trouble those ideas in his 20th seminar, when he presents what's he describes as the graph of situation, which I talk about in the book, where there's two sides, and he does talk about them as the masculine side and the feminine side, but he also complicates that idea and says, well, it's not necessary to be a woman to be on the feminine side, which still, what does that mean? Say there's a masculine side and a feminine side, but you don't have to be a woman to be on the feminine side. It's like, that's a challenge to our thinking, and I think that's what he was trying to do, to say, okay, this is how we're talking about it, because we can only talk about it in the language that we have to talk about it. But he's trying to pull that language in a different direction, open up a different way of thinking, a different way of conceiving sex, gender, sexual relationships, because they all start to fall into this this field of thought, this way of conceiving things, how we relate to other people. So you see Lacan then start to have, a strong influence on discourses that came after him, and some feminist theorists were very influenced by Lacan. Some find Lacan, some feminist theorists find the whole of the psychoanalytic project deeply problematic. I suspect they've probably read less Lacan, and I think the ones who've read more Lacan actually see that Lacan doesn't really fall into that position himself. He's actually doing something much more liberating, dangerous. But I don't think that aspect of his project he ever completed. And I think it's their ideas were still working through. We still think in terms of gender. We still think in terms of binary gender. And even though that discourse is, in terms of public discourse, is starting to change, it's still a responsive change. So it's a change into response to a conventional conception of binary gender, which is also to say then we still, at some level, even if it's a negative level, we're endorsing that idea of the binary. We're saying, I don't accept the binary. You're still acknowledging the binary in order to say you don't accept it. So I think in terms of where we are in history, we're still grappling with that idea. But I think Lacan gives us some tools to grapple differently.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I've heard Alenka Zupanci speak about the LGBTQ plus, and she was focusing on this element of the plus, which I found quite intriguing. I would say maybe, for Lacan, it was the M for man and W plus. It is the encore, which is the name of the 20th seminar that characterizes whatever potentiality identifies in something that is essentially feminine. And it's interesting because we read it and we implement it in the field of gender studies, but it also must have a clinical value. And I think this is where these thoughts are most important, maybe today especially. But let me ask you a final question. I'll open then the stage for everyone, I promise. But I just want to talk to you about a subject that you engage with in the end of the book. And this has to do with the end of analysis. And it's true that in the end of Freud's career, he entertained the notion that analysis might be interminable. And this is a concept that understandably may sound daunting to those who actually consider to go to analysis. But for Lacan, it is important that analysis ends, even if we choose to undergo another analysis later in our lives. So the conclusion of an analysis is marked by various concepts in Lacan's teaching. Concepts that are quite interesting. You mentioned some of them, like subjective destitution, the traversal of the fantasy, what Lacan calls the symptom, and even what in some schools is called the pass. So all of these are names to engage with different culminations of the analysis. So I wanted you to maybe elaborate about what it means to conclude an analysis in Lacanian terms. How do these concepts that I just mentioned, and you can choose any one, define the possible outcomes of finishing an analysis? And this will also be the concluding question for my interview with you. So
from my perspective, there's not a single end to analysis, what it would mean to end analysis. And I don't think Lacan is necessarily suggesting there is either. That there are many reasons people would go into analysis, and there must then be an equal number of reasons that people would, or manners in which, or positions in which people would end analysis. So, I think to think about the end of analysis, we have to think about the beginning of analysis. What puts you into analysis in the first place? Do you go to analysis because there's something blocking your life that's stopping you living your life the way you want to live it? Something, but in very, very simple terms, you're not happy. So you go see an analyst in the hope that somehow talking to them, working things through will bring you to a position of happiness, or somehow talking to them, working things through will help you untie that knot or that blockage in your life that lets you move on in some ways. Or I think a lot of people go into analysis, particularly Lacanian analysis, because they want to become analysts. So there's, those are three kind of broad reasons you might go into analysis. And I think they lead to very different kinds of conclusion, not necessarily in the sense that each one of those has its own conclusion, because once you're in analysis, the whole journey can become quite entangled, and your reason for being in analysis can change over time. It's not necessarily the reason that got you in there in the first place. So I think when Lacan's talking about the end of analysis, he's talking about different possibilities that are to do with a more the abstract structures that he's working through. So in order to work through a framework of understanding what the subject is, there are clear points which would indicate a termination of analysis, but how that translates into individual people in analysis, I think is quite a separate thing. So for example, Lacan talks about traversal of the fantasy, which is, again, there's a very simple point that Lacan's trying to make, that we entertain fantasies, and by going to analysis and working things through an analysis, by talking, by hearing ourselves talking, by going out of analysis and working again over the things we've said or we think we said in analysis, by recounting dreams and all these things we do in analysis, we come to realize that our fantasy is a fantasy. So we put our fantasy into a particular perspective, and then that stops it being our fantasy. And Lacan talks about the fundamental fantasy, not in the sense that there is one particular fantasy that we have that's stronger than all the other fantasies, or one that's truer than the other fantasies. The fundamental fantasy is the commonality that underpins the various different fantasies that we tell ourselves, that we live by. And traversing that fantasy is simply kind of unmasking the fantasy as the fantasy it is. And one very simple way of putting it is what's fundamental in fantasy for everyone is that it will all be okay in the end. So you have a very obvious end of analysis there, because it's never okay in the end. And you leave analysis not at the point where everything's okay. You leave analysis at the point where you accept it's never really going to be okay, but you can kind of carry on anyway and accept that knowledge. So that's one way of conceiving the end of analysis. I talk in a little bit more length in the book about subjective destitution, which kind of overlaps in many ways with that idea that, just as we talked at the very beginning of the interview about the mirror stage and this idea of taking an idea from outside and internalizing it and beginning to identify with it, what Lacan's talking about is breaking that idea down again. So in English, at least, destitution has a very negative sense. There's a kind of connotation of being exposed and left alone, and somehow I think out there on the steps, alone and cold and destitute and impoverished. But the term actually just means the opposite of, or the way Lacan's using it, it's the opposite of constitution. So in the mirror stage, you constitute a sense of self, but it's a mistaken sense of self. So at the other end, destitution is unconstituting that sense of self. So again, like the traversing the fantasy, it's coming to that point of acceptance that the you that you have spent your whole life insisting that you are, even if, or particularly if it's an unhappy insistence, actually isn't you at all. But that's a very hard thing to do, even if the you that you've insisted on is not something you're happy with. It performs a function. It provides a certain sense of satisfaction. So there is an intense difficulty in giving that up and saying, well, this, for want of a better way of putting it, this false self is not me, and there's no me behind that. That's a very difficult position to accept. So, and I think, that is what Lacan's pointing at. But does anyone actually achieve that other than Spider-Man? I'm not sure.
It's a very good question. There's a lot of testimonies, but who's the judge?
Oh yes. Well, that's it. Each of us is the judge.
Yes, eventually that's the case. So thanks for bearing with me so far, Calum. I'm now going to open the stage for questions. So it's an opportunity for our listeners to engage with you about the ideas that we spoke about, or about anything that would be the basics in Lacan.